This meeting is being recorded.
Well, I want to welcome everybody to Amherst Neighbors. We are blessed with living here in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts, that we have a lot of wonderful writers. And in particular, we have a lot of writers who are members of Amherst Neighbors. And realizing the number of writers that we have within just a few miles of here, Amherst Neighbors Programs Committee, which I am on, has started a local writers program where we invite local authors to come and talk about the books that they've written. And today we're having something a little unusual. We're not only having the author, Wendy Vowell, who will be publishing the book in a year. The name of her book is What Happened to Uncle Harold? And we actually have the person who whispered into into Wendy's ear, "What happened to Uncle Harold?" And he's here. And the nephew of Uncle Harold is Gary Leaf. And I've been working, I know Wendy because I'm in the same writing group as her. And I've been hearing bits and pieces of this book for about the last year and a half. And I just find it absolutely incredible. And one of the things that I think you're going to find is there's an incredible amount of detail about what happens on this submarine. And it's a World War II submarine. And it's just astounding how accurate Wendy is. And the reason that she's so accurate is because she has on her left, and he can raise his hand and say hello, is Tom Bowser. And I am told that Tom is probably the preeminent historian of World War II submarines in the United States. And he has been working closely with Wendy to ensure accuracy in her book. And and right now the three of them are in Mobile, Alabama, at the USS Drum Submarine Museum, and they are actually in a battleship, the USS Alabama, and they're sitting at this table, and it's a little echoey, so we have to just be a little tolerant of listening carefully. Once we get going, Wendy is going to begin by giving an overview of her book and what's happening. And then Gary will give a little introduction about, I think, his uncle. Wendy is going to do some readings that I've really looking forward to. And then Tom will be jumping in as needed. There's going to be about 3 different readings. We'll probably have about an hour program. And then probably about an hour from now, at around 5 o'clock, we'll stop and we will have questions and answers. But while the program is going on, we ask you to keep yourself muted, and we'll just leave it up to Wendy to kind of guide us through this adventure that I've been looking forward to for quite a while now. And so I can turn it over to Wendy, and I want to thank Wendy and Tom and Gary for doing this for us, all the way from Mobile, Alabama.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Well, let's start by saying how exciting it is. We are currently inside the commission room on the USS Alabama, which is a World War II battleship. The USS Drum Submarine Museum is right next door. We are not inside the submarine because it runs silent. There is no Wi-Fi, no computer, no cell phone service inside that submarine, just like the Romans. So we are blessed to have the support of the submarine, of the museum and the park here. We want to thank Janet Cobb, Executive Director, for allowing us to be here. Of course, we want to thank Tom Bowser, historian, and Ashley Milnett, who is just off camera, is Communications Director, and she's running the audio visual for us. For starters, we're going to talk about who Uncle Harold was and why we're still talking about him 80 years after he went missing in action in 1944. And this journey that we've been on, Gary and I started this in 2021 in the middle of COVID, just after I finished a book. And Gary will give us kind of an introduction, and we'll move on to a little bit more in depth about what submarine service is. We'll talk about why we believe Gary's uncle enlisted in submarine service. And then we'll talk about his very first war patrol in which he actually went out on the submarine and what that was like inside the boat. Depending on time, we may do the third, another war patrol in which the crew was battling with fire. I'm not sure we'll have time for that. So for right now, Gary, take it away. Let's hear about your uncle.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. My name is Gary Leaf, and Uncle Harold was my uncle, although I never met him, of course, but he was my dad's oldest brother. I grew up in eastern Washington State with my parents and my sister, and my Grandma Gertrude, who time and time again, the name will come up. She had a farm in western Washington State where she grew berries, pears, and apples, and an assortment of other agricultural products, but she also raised chickens. And during my high school years, I actually spent 2 summers living with Grandma Gertrude because I was able to work at a nearby restaurant courtesy of a close family friend. But whenever Grandma Gertrude and I had the opportunity to talk, it always focused on 3 items. Chickens, for one, because I was responsible for taking care of the sparrows in the chicken coop, because the sparrows would eat the chicken feed. So my job was to make sure that the sparrows were non-existent in the chicken coop. My grandma was also very religious with respect to believing in God. And that always came up in a discussion because she's always trying to persuade me to attend Sunday morning church. Well, working in a restaurant Sunday mornings was also part of my working schedule, so I was not able to go to church with her. But nevertheless, she always tried to encourage me going to church with her. And the third topic, of course, was Uncle Harold. On December 7th, 1941, like all American men of age, they entered the military service. They either wanted to fight the Japanese or to fight the Germans. But it was an extreme amount of turmoil in the country, a lot of concern about the future for these young men, but they only had one objective, and that was to go to war and fight for their country. That was really the first or the last time that my grandma and the family saw Uncle Harold until June of 1943, when he came home on a 30-day leave. He was a qualified submariner at that time. He'd already spent 1 war patrol in the Pacific, but they came back to Merrill Island in San Francisco for complete maintenance overhaul. And during that maintenance overhaul, he was given a 30-day leave. He went up to Seattle, probably by bus. The family had not seen or heard from him in over a year and a half. And all of a sudden, he came walking up the driveway, to the amazement of my grandma and the rest of the family members. Like all 30-day leaves, the time was spent there in Grandma's farm, and he had to return back to base. That was the last time the family saw Uncle Harold. I remember when I was living with Grandma that she always had a Blue Star flag hanging in the living room window. That Blue Star represented men who were enlisted in the military. And it just showed everyone that, yes, that particular family had a member in the service represented by that Blue Star. At that time, I often saw that Blue Star, and not really knowing the full gamut of who Uncle Harold was, there really wasn't any connection on my part with Uncle Harold. In 1944, the U.S. Navy sent a telegram to the family saying that Uncle Harold was MIA, missing in action. Later, they told the family that he was lost at sea. But my grandma, with her faith in God, never gave up hope that someday that Uncle Harold would be walking up that driveway like he did a year and a half earlier. So that Blue Star flag remained in that window. Despite the loss of her son, she thought it was more appropriate for her to hang that Blue Star rather than becoming a Gold Star parent. Jumping into the 1980s, my career was as a geophysicist. And the last 14 years of my career, I spent it internationally. I lived in Southeast Asia, so I spent a lot of time on an airplane crisscrossing the Pacific Ocean and South China Sea, landing and taking off from places like Tokyo, Taiwan, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I didn't realize at the time that I could have very well been flying over routes that Uncle Harold was performing in the Grayback during the war. I was flying at 35,000 feet connecting business, and 40 years earlier, Uncle Harold could have been 250 feet below the surface, conducting a war patrol. But again, even though I was flying over perhaps paths that we crossed, I still had no connection with my uncle. In 2019, the Lost 52 project, which primary objective is to find the World War II submarines that are actually lost, located the USS Grayback, 1,400 feet of water off the coast of Okinawa. The Lost 52 project conversed with most of the members of the U.S. Grayback family members 40 years, 50 or 60 years hence, to let them know that the Grayback had been found, and in so doing, it brought a lot of closure to the family members. But for me, it just brought more closure about who Uncle Harold was. My wife passed away in 2020, and shortly after that, I met Wendy. Well, Wendy happened to be a writer, and she just finished a book about her ex-father-in-law, who was in World War II, and he also happened to be a prisoner of war in Germany. She had finished that book when we started talking on, of all days, July 4th, 2021, and she's asking me about what should I write about again? And I mentioned Uncle Harold. And since that July 4th, 2021 date, we have been on a journey finding out who Uncle Harold was. And at that time, the last couple of years, I now have a connection with my Uncle Harold. This book is, hopefully, will be completed next year in 2025. And I'd like to dedicate this book to my grandma Gertrude and all my family members. Thank you.
Okay, that was a rough conversation. I feel like I'm gonna bawl. I'm so emotional, Gary. Okay. Let me get my bearings here for a minute. Oh, my goodness. One of the videos that we saw on the Lost 52 Project website, they were interviewing the family of a sailor by the name of Earl Halverson. And Earl Halverson's mother, Earl was also lost on the Grayback, his mother had been communicating with other mothers, other family members. She created a scrapbook, and she started gathering all these letters and addresses and pictures that people sent her. And some of her descendants had salvaged this scrapbook, and in that scrapbook, on this TV interview, so many years later, was a picture of Gary's grandmother and his uncle and his Aunt Ida. And we kind of took that as a sign, okay, yes, we are on the right track, we need to pursue this. So shortly after we started this journey, we decided to go to Groton, Connecticut, to New London, Connecticut, where the Submarine Museum is. I didn't know anything about submarine service. All I knew was it's top secret. And it was going to be a little more difficult than the previous research I had done with the 15th Air Force. Our very first trip, and I said, if we can find something great, we'll continue. If it's still top secret, we'll just step aside and move on to something else. On that first trip to New London, we met with an archivist there who gave us a copy of Harold Leaf's submarine school report card. In that report card, Harold Leaf was #1 in his sonar class of 7 students. And we said, okay, we're on the right track. If we're supposed to be doing this, we've at least got a good start. As we were leaving, Gary stopped to talk to a young security guard at the entrance. And Gary, what did he say?
The security guard asked us if we had been to the World War II Memorial, which was 2 miles down the road. So we got in our vehicle and we followed the road for 2 miles, and sure enough, we came upon the World War II memorial. And in that memorial, there, as I mentioned before, there's 52 lost submarines in World War II. And in that World War II memorial, there were the names of all the members belonging to those 52 submarines, including my Uncle Harold. It was sort of a surreal moment that growing up on the West Coast, here I was seeing my uncle's name on the East Coast. And in hindsight, when we were walking along the Groton, Connecticut Naval Base and submarine base, I could very well have been walking over the footsteps that my Uncle Harold had been crossing over 80 years beforehand.
Keep in mind that it was still the middle of COVID, so there was kind of limited on where we could go and how many museums were available to us. That winter, we were scheduled to go to Melbourne, Florida for about 6 weeks, and then we were gonna go to Houston, Texas for about 6 weeks. So we picked up the map, we looked at it and said, okay, how many World War II submarine museums are there on this path? And how many are open, even though it's COVID at that time? So we did our trip to Melbourne, and then we scheduled a visit to the USS Drum. And as I was researching about the USS Drum, I found out that it was open, but I also said that there was this great historian named Tom Bowser that worked on the Drum, and that I could make an appointment to see him. We weren't sure what day we were gonna be there. I screwed up, did not make the appointment in advance. So we just kind of arrived cold and asked to see him. The woman at the gate here at the museum was kind enough to page Tom on the grounds, and he appeared. We were all wearing masks. And this man, unprepared, gave us a 4-hour tour inside the Drum dedicated to just us, showing us how this boat looked and how it compared to the Grayback. All the mechanics, the structure, the engines from the torpedoes. I think he even invited me to crawl in a torpedo tube if I wanted to, and I'm still kicking myself because I didn't do it. After we left the USS Drum and we went on to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, I was disappointed there because there was so little about the submarine service at the World War II Museum. We went on to Houston, and while we were there, we visited Galveston to the Cabela, which was also a World War II museum. Again, we got a personal tour from one of the executives there, but it was nothing like our visit with Tom here. Tom was so personable, and he was able to explain to us, okay, if your uncle was a sonar tech, then this is what he would have been doing. And here's the sonar equipment, and this is how it operates, even though it might not be completely operational here. And he had to stay on lookout duty, and this is how we did it. It was just an incredible experience. So some of our family members, David and Christy are on the call with us, and Dolores, I'm not sure she's on the call with us. None of us could figure out how we ended up in submarine service. And the more we learned about it, the scarier it got, because the rate of lost people was pretty incredible. And I was looking for autobiographical accounts of submariners, why they enlisted in submarine service, and what were they doing there, and how, what was life really like. Unlike Air Force and Army, there were like almost no personal accounts from enlisted men. There were all kinds of personal accounts by executives and officers, but we didn't have that wealth of information from the enlisted men like Uncle Harold. And Tom kept telling me, well, only 2% of the Navy was submarine service. So I finally started looking at statistics, and sure enough, at the time in World War II, we had something like 16 million Americans in uniform. Out of that 16 million, there were only 16,000 in the submarine service. And out of those 16,000, more than 3,500 men were lost, submariners were lost before the end of the war. So that leaves 11,500 men to come home after the war that were submariners and write their own stories. No wonder I couldn't find any stories that were written by enlisted men and what it had been like being on that boat. So that made some of the reference really hard. What was helpful with Tom is because he had all these stories. Tom, where did you collect all these fun stories?
From some vets that visited the Drum as they come through it. That's the best thing working on it. You meet all these sub vets. And the World War II crews from the Drum came over for a reunion every year. And of course, I listened to all their stories and learned lot from them.
So you got to actually meet the submariners from World War II,
Right.
and you got to hang out with them.
Yeah.
And they would tell you these stories.
Well, usually only after we got to the hotel room, to the hospitality room, and they got a couple of drinks in. And then they would tell the stories.
So then they tell you fun stories like hazing and.
Yeah. And also it helped being a submariner. They knew they could tell me these stories and I would understand.
So what I'm hearing are secondhand accounts from the guys who didn't write it down.
You're right.
They passed it on to you to become a memory keeper.
Right.
Wow, that is so incredible. So now I understand exactly how he is so in-depth on some of the fun stories and the fact checks that he does for me. So Gary and I spent a lot of time at the library in Amherst, the Jones Library, but we did things like mechanical drawings and technical books written by high-level guys about politics and why certain guys wanted their books written, boats built a certain way. Gary kept telling me, hey, we need to find old vintage newspapers from the Vancouver Columbian Evening Newspaper. Grandma always took the Vancouver Columbian. Looks like our session is expiring. Julia?
Not on my end. Everything on my end looks good. I'm recording it and
that?
not on my end.
Can you still hear me?
We can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. So I emailed the Vancouver Columbian newspaper, and lo and behold, they still are family owned for over 80 years. And I said, look, I can't find your newspapers on newspapers.com. And I got a response back saying, give us until May. I think I emailed them in January. We've just sent all of our files off to be scanned. Starting in May, they will be available on newspapers.com. When we started looking for them, I think I waited until June to start looking. We discovered that Gary's grandma Gertrude had been like a press agent for Harold and Ida, her older daughter and Harold. And every time they did something, she made sure it went in the newspaper. So we had his entire childhood documented. Every time he played the game, every time he was in Scouts, he went to an event, he got a pin, we had everything we needed. We also discovered that he had been in citizen military training camp, which was a volunteer program and like a miniature boot camp, 1 month out of every summer. He had done 2 years of citizen military training camp. So when December 7th happened, he went right in, unlike other guys who tried to volunteer and couldn't be taken until like May or June. They took him almost immediately. 3 days after he signed up, he was already shipped out. So I'm going to flash forward a little bit. We know from files, we finally went into the archives in St. Louis and got my hands on his actual personnel files. In April of this year, I was able to scan every document in his personnel file from the war documents. And we know that he went to boot camp in San Diego and was in sonar training. And then he was shipped out for his first deployment to New York City. And that's where I went back to Tom again. And I said, Tom, when they sent these guys coast to coast, how did they send them? Did they put them on a plane?
Well, back then, not on planes, usually trains or buses. Not a lot of aircraft travel back those days. Most likely by train.
So how long would it take you on a train?
3 or 4 days.
Okay, so he gets on a train and there's no showers on a train.
That's what I do. Yeah, there might have been.
So he's going coast to coast without a shower, without changing clothes?
Probably, but sponge baths,
Okay.
preparation for submarine duty.
But he hadn't signed up yet. Okay, he's going to New York. And based on the fact that he's going to New York, he's probably going out to the Atlantic. It's probably going to be like German U-boats. Okay. And in the movies, they show the guys on the boat, on the trains, just playing cards and talking and singing. Is that what it was really like?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So my next section, I'm going to talk about him arriving in New York. Harold has been talking and smoking and playing cards with all the guys on the train. And he basically got a crowdsourced version of the war from the enlisted man's point of view. Again and again, he heard that the Atlantic fleet was tough. Chiefs were strict, dress code was rigid, Food was awful, fresh water was scarce. There were rules, schedules, and so many things to remember. The Atlantic was a war zone, and German U-boats ruled the Atlantic. Naval warfare was not for sissies. On the train, Harold met a sailor or two with those rare silver dolphin on sleeve, the insignia for submarine duty. It was like meeting a warlock special to deep sea magic. Submariners all brag that they got the best food in the Navy and plenty of it. While at sea, the submariners refused to shave. They were self-proclaimed renegades who scoffed at tidy haircuts and uniform inspections. Submarine duty was the toughest in the world, for which they were paid an extra 50% hazard pay. Harold realized he could have all that too, but only if he volunteered, and only if he could make it through the elite submarine school. It was like making a deal with the devil. On June 23rd, 1942, the train arrived at Grand Central Station in Lower Manhattan. Harold stepped onto solid ground into heat, humidity, diesel fumes, and his own body odor. Inside the station, he paused to take in the arched ceiling, the grand staircase packed with people. He checked the time on the giant clock over the crowded ticket window. A quick stop for directions, and Harold stepped outside to get his bearings. On the street, towering buildings blocked the sun. There was only concrete to walk on, rimmed with soggy garbage and cigarette butts. Pier 92, his destination, was at the end of West 52nd Street. All the streets and avenues were numbered. All Harold had to do was follow the numbers west to the Hudson River. Sea bag on his shoulder, Harold started walking. His heels clicked on the sidewalk at a boot camp cadence. The streets were crowded with more men in uniform, army green, officer khakis, and lots of navy white. He finally started to comprehend the massive number of Americans going to war. From a street vendor, Harold stopped and bought a hot dog. A block later, he bought a slice of New York-style pizza folded in half like a sandwich. All the while, his sea bag rode his sweaty shoulder like a turtle shell. As he passed a newsstand, the New York Daily News headline shouted in bold type, "A Jap sub dug the shell hole in Oregon." Harold stopped in his tracks and reread the headline. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Oregon? Next to the headline was a photo of the hole. The journalist described a Japanese attack on Fort Stevens in Astoria, Oregon, at the mouth of the Columbia River. The newspaper continued. The shelling lasted 15 minutes. One shell landed within 100 yards of a residence occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Heffling and their two children. In his mind, Harold pictured a map of the Columbia River. Fort Stevens was less than 100 miles from his own parents in Salmon Creek, Washington. Harold scoured the paper for more information. Only one more article appeared in that day's news. In it, Harold learned the Japanese had also attempted an attack on an American base at Midway. He didn't know anything about Midway. The paper on Harold's hands rustled as he scoured the pages for more. He didn't see any casualties. There was no more information about the attack in Oregon. He pictured a map in his mind with Fort Stevens less than 100 miles from his parents. He thumbed through the pages one more time in search of West Coast news. Only one more war-related, Harold wondered how long before the Japanese Navy sailed right up the Columbia River. How long before enemy subs make it to Vancouver? How long before Japan bombs Kaiser shipyards at Vancouver? How long before bombs fall in my own parents' backyard? How long before Japan invades the entire West Coast? The news was already a couple days old. What's happened since that first attack? Is my family okay? Harold's nails dug into his palms. He recalled the fear and paranoia on the day Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Harold had enlisted specifically to fight the Japanese. Less than 7 months later, his worst fears were coming true. Japan bombed Oregon, and he wasn't there. His own hometown was virtually defenseless. He tucked the newspaper into his sea bag and continued west toward Pier 92. It was 7 months since Harold had enlisted. Summer already. Boot camp was over. He had his Sonar Tech rating. Harold was still nowhere near the war against Japan. He wanted more than anything to protect his hometown. One clear objective crystallized in Harold's mind. I got to get back to the West Coast and deal with the Japanese. Let somebody else fight the Germans. New York was Harold's pivot point. If he did nothing, he could be deployed right away, probably in the North Atlantic. There would be storms and brutal weather in winter. He would eat lousy food. and get paid the same as everybody else for 5.5 more years. He would have to deal with the discipline and dress code every single day. All he had to do was follow orders. But what if he helped beat the Germans in the Atlantic and his parents were killed by Japanese? What if he sacrificed everything and his parents were still in danger? Down deep, Harold was terrified of dying in the wrong war, in the wrong ocean, having done nothing to help protect the people he loved. What if he volunteered for submarine service? If his request was approved, he would not go to war right away. He would spend a few weeks or months in submarine school and then go to war, probably in the Pacific. He could help fight against Japan. If he flunked out of submarine school, then it was up to the Navy where he went next. He had to at least try. On June 25th, 1942, Harold Leaf volunteered for submarine school. It was the day before his 20th birthday. So Tom, you've been to that same submarine school, have you not?
Yeah.
So if they're gonna send him from New York City up to New London, Connecticut, how would they send him?
Train.
You get on the train again.
Yeah.
He's been off the train for 3 days and he's already getting back on the train right away.
Yeah.
And when he gets up to submarine school, what do they do to him?
Actually, submarine school, you're treated pretty good. It's not like boot camp anymore.
Okay.
But first you get 2 days psychological testing to make sure you're crazy enough. Then they test you for claustrophobia. For some reason, that's a problem with a lot of
I
people.
can't imagine why.
I can't either. Then they have tests for stress. They thought this was stressful duty,
Okay.
but we never understood that either. It's only about 30% of the people who volunteer make it through.
30%?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then you have 8 weeks of classroom study where they teach you the basics. Each submarine is a little bit different, so they can't teach you exactly everything. But they teach you all the piping systems and how the systems dive and load. And you actually go out on an active submarine and dive a couple of times. That's not a test for claustrophobia, see who freaks out.
Okay.
And it does get to some people. But then the school itself, it was pretty hard, a lot of the technical information. But you're treated good. Yeah, you get liberty all the time. It's not like boot camp, you're fun and confined.
Okay. So he finishes up submarine school, then does he go straight to war?
Well, it depends. Sometimes you go to a school to learn a job, like electrician, engineer, sonar, radar, depending. Sometimes we'll send you straight to the boat and you learn on the boat.
Okay, in his case, he was Sonar Tech. He said he did a little more sonar training there, we know from his submarine school record. And he went in to submarine school in July 43, and then October 43, they deployed him to Brisbane, Australia. So let's talk about, how did he get to Brisbane?
Probably on a transport ship.
Okay,
You know, only top ranking officers had to fly to Pearl Harbor and then to wherever. So most of them were transferred to transport ships.
so they probably put him back on the train to the West Coast.
Oh, yeah.
And then from San Francisco, I think his record said he was transferred to San Francisco. And then he waited on a transport ship from San Francisco to Brisbane. And based on what I was reading, those transports went out in big convoys.
Yeah.
It could be how many ships in a convoy?
Well, there'd be at least 1 or 2 oilers, and then 3 or 4, transports, liberty ships, cargo ships, depending on what exactly left and what was needed for each ship at the time.
Okay. So his records show that he got to Brisbane in, I can't remember for sure, late November, early December. And they put him to work around the docks there in Brisbane. What would he have been doing until April, till he finally went out? That's like 3.5 months.
Well, they probably assigned them to the submarine tender to help repair submarines when they came in until they could find a position.
Okay.
That's quite well.
Okay, so he's at the submarine base, which is just up the Brisbane River, and he's working as a whatever they want him to do.
Yeah.
And repairs for 3.5 months, even though he was a sonar tech.
Yeah.
Okay,
It could have been just cleaning and painting, things like that,
Okay,
because he really didn't have a rating yet.
so he didn't have a rating yet. That means that he hasn't taken his final test?
Well, he hadn't got
Okay.
designation.
Okay, so 23rd of April on Good Friday, he is told to report to the USS Grayback SS208 for his first war patrol. He's finally going to go out to sea in the South Pacific. And of course, it's the tropics and it is hot. And as he leaves Brisbane, and they are heading towards the equator. So it's going to get even hotter inside that submarine. And I'm going to read a section about that first war patrol, about the first week out. It's currently May 2nd, 1943. He's already been at sea for about a week. And they've run into a storm. And this is based on what Tom has told me and a couple of other books. This is what it was like inside that boat in a storm. Grayback cruised the designated lane southeast of Papua New Guinea. On the surface, the sea swells were so high, all the hatches had to be kept closed. The air inside was stifling and humid. Thermostat was pegged at 105 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no air conditioner. Crewmen walked around with puke cans tied around their neck while they worked. Harold was thirsty. His 1 cup of rationed water was gone by breakfast, and the water distiller didn't work very well in the storm. Harold had a headache. Sweat dripped off his nose and ran down his cheeks. The floor around him was a slippery mess of vomit and cold sweat. The air inside the boat reeked of sewage, vomit, and sweaty men. It was too hot for regulation uniforms. The enlisted men worked in their skivvies and Navy-issued sandals with sewn-on soles. Even the officers stripped down to a pair of sandals and shorts. It was too hot for boots and socks. Besides, work boots with hobnail soles were too noisy for silent running. The galley stove had been shut down, was on lockdown since the storm started. It was for safety. Cook served cold sandwiches every meal, mostly ham and cheese. The fresh milk was all used up, and they were down to powdered milk. The ice cream machine still worked, but it couldn't keep up with demand. There was always plenty of coffee, hot, strong, and salty, served from a 30-cup percolator bolted down in a galley window. In the mess area, the tables were stainless steel. They didn't have rails to keep plates from sliding off. Instead, Harold learned how to put a wet towel under his dish to keep it in place. While he ate, he held down his plate with one hand. A finger looked through his coffee cup handle. His other hand was kept free for a fork. Hot coffee sloshed out of his cup if he filled it too full. Harold learned to move with the pitch and roll of the boat, a half cup of coffee in one hand. For a few hours every day, Harold crawled into his bunk for some shut-eye. In the storm, his bunk felt like a balking bronco. It pitched so violently he had to strap himself into bed. The sheets were always damp, his pillow was soggy. The bunk above him was so close to his face he couldn't turn over. His shoulders were too wide to sleep on his side. It was hard to shut out the noise and fluorescent lights while the other guys were still on duty. And there were always men on duty. Sometimes Harold retreated to his berth to get away from a mouthy crew member. It wasn't like working at the gas station where he got home at the end of 8 hours. Here, he was stuck with the same guys in the same place at the end of every shift. On most days, he got less than 4 hours of sleep before he was rousted for an emergency drill or to go on duty. He added lack of sleep to his list of miseries. On May 5th, the Grayback had been in the storm for 3 days already. Lieutenant Commander Stefan had no idea how long it would last. Since May 2nd, they had been practically standing still, averaging only 5 knots per hour. They were in enemy territory. The waves were too high to put lookouts on deck. The sonar was state of the art, but the sloshing water drowned out every other sound. The SJ radar hadn't worked since they left Brisbane. Even if they spotted an enemy ship, the sea was too rough for torpedoes or the deck guns. Grayback was literally running blind. After 3 days of misery inside the boat, Stefan made a drastic decision. He sent a coded radio message to command. Grayback was moving to a previously assigned area for patrol. Stefan turned the boat into the wind and set a course for the northeast side of Papua New Guinea, north of the Japanese military base at Revolve, and hopefully away from the storm. It took five more days to get there. 5 more days of extreme weather, abysmal visibility, and horrific seas kept Harold and the other lookouts below the whole time. It was too dangerous to even think about going topside. Down below, most of them were seasick and dehydrated. All they could do was tough it out. On May 10th, Grayback finally sailed into clear skies and calmer waters. its first war patrol was off to an epic start. I'm going to stop there, and Tom, talk to me about the water distiller. That's one of the most critical elements on boat for life support, and I am just fascinated by this thing.
And they had two distillers. They made 250 gallons a day apiece if they were working right. They were basically an electric boiler. You boil the seawater, the steam would come up and condense the steam with the seawater. The South Pacific, the seawater temperature was 85 degrees, so it didn't do a good job of condensing the steam rapid enough. So they were lucky if they could get 100 gallons a day of pure water. Pure water had to go to the batteries. The batteries were used hard, so they lost a lot of water out of them, like your car battery used to be. And so that's where the pure water went. That's pure water. Went to the coffee pot. That was the next priority. After that, cooking. And then after that, there wasn't much left. You got 1 cup of water a day to do with as you please. You had to figure out your priorities. If you're going to bathe in it or brush your teeth first. And so most of the people use coffee to brush their teeth. And a lot of them bathed in coffee because there's always coffee. And of course, the coffee and the water had a slight salty taste because it wasn't the pure battery water. But, and to cook, of course, everything you cook with it was the same.
So 100 gallons of water per distiller or just total?
Per distiller.
So that's roughly 200 gallons on the worst days.
Yeah, and that's if they can get them working right. In heavy seas, it's really hard because some of the brine will splash over the diffuser and contaminate the water, the steam. So it was really, really hard to get pure water out of this.
So they're cooking up a batch of water and then they have salt water splashed into it and contaminates it?
The salt water they're boiling off
Okay,
is inside the boiler.
okay.
It's splashing around from movement too. And plus it's boiling, so that you got water flying up. And it's constant seawater flowing through. So it's really difficult.
So I think you told me once that they could only run the distiller when they were on the surface.
Right, because they use up the battery, when they were submerged, run on the battery. And, because the electric motors, electric blower on it, and electric pumps, pump the water through. So, and electric heaters, so they couldn't run them submerged.
So this sounds like a vicious cycle. I've got a distiller, I have to make distilled water for the batteries so I can run below surface. But if I'm running below surface, I'm using up distilled water, but I can't run the distiller unless I'm on the surface.
Right.
Because it draws too much power.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And they're in a war zone, they need to run below the surface.
Yeah, when they're submerged, they cut down on electrical use as much as possible. Ventilation fans are shut off. Any unnecessary equipment shut off. And necessary equipment sometimes is shut off. And they can only stay down for 24 hours on the battery, going real slow. Yeah, a lot of times they're going backwards.
Wow. So a couple days ago, I mean, we talked about salty coffee since you and I first met. I'm kind of used to that concept. But it only just dawned on me a couple days ago that powdered milk was also liquefied with salty water.
Yeah.
That they were drinking salty water, and if they made powdered milk and tried to drink powdered milk, it turned into milk, it would be salty also.
Yeah, just slightly.
Just slightly.
They did have to take salt tablets to replace their salt.
I wouldn't think they would.
And they didn't drink a lot of milk. They didn't drink coffee.
Okay. Okay, so since you and I started working together, we first started out with a call maybe once a month, and I would send you some material and we'd talk and I'd ask questions and we'd fact check it. And then we started a little more often. I'd email you and say, hey, can I set up a call? And then sometime last summer, I think it was, we made it an every week thing.
Yeah.
And every single Tuesday, it's on our calendars. Sometimes it's 4:30, 5 o'clock your time, something like that. And we'll have a conversation about the pages I've sent you, and we'll fact check it, come back with a fun story. And then we move on to other stuff where we're talking about life in general. So we started out with a 4-hour personal tour on the drum, and now we've become best buds. I can't tell you how fun this has been, how exciting we are to be
No, I
here.
look forward to every phone call.
So we have one more section that I wanted to read here. Since we have a little bit of time, this is this particular section is in December 1943. It is not the last war patrol, it's close to it. And by the way, the sections that I'm reading on these war patrols are pulled from actual military documents. Every commander of the boat was required to write a war patrol. It's almost an hour by hour, minute by minute report of everything that happened on the boat during the time they were at sea. So what Tom has helped me do is take that information, commander report, wrote for the admiral at a very high level and say, okay, this is what the admiral said, this is what the commander said, this is what that looked like from a enlisted man's point of view, and this is what Sonar Tech would have been doing, and that's what's been extremely helpful here. But in December of 1943, there was a fire on board. And the small section I'm going to read to you here, and while I'm reading this, you might want to grab a glass of water or tea or coffee or something. We're going to do a submariner's toast to those who didn't make it home after this reading. Tom's going to do this toast for us. So it's in military speak, it's 2100 hours. What is that, 9 o'clock at night? 9 o'clock at night, 2100 hours is 9 o'clock at night, and they are just off the coast of one of the Japanese islands. And Grayback was cruising on the surface, charging batteries. The hatches were open for fresh air. Harold's carbon dioxide headache was already gone. The sun was down. Lookouts were on deck with night vision binoculars. The air was a balmy 72 degrees without a cloud in the sky. If they had not been in enemy water, Harold might have enjoyed the quiet time. Suddenly, everything went dark. He looked up from his sonar's vacant eye and blinked several times. The emergency lights flickered and came on. The radar scope was dark too. The torpedo data computer readouts were blank. All 5 men in the conning tower looked confused. Somebody muttered, "What happened? Roosevelt forget to pay the light bill?" The 1MC blared, "General quarters, fire in the engine room." Harold muttered, "Oh boy, this can't be good." Harold dashed to the nearest emergency locker. He pulled out a flashlight and oxygen breathing apparatus. There was no smoke in the conning tower yet. He hung the OBA, the oxygen breathing apparatus, around his neck and went back to sonar. In Harold's mind, he could visualize the firefight below deck. Firefighters grabbed CO2 extinguishers and raced to the engine room. The compartment door would be sealed behind them. Once inside, nobody got out till the fire was out. But what an awful place for a fire. The mechanics left greasy rags lying around. They stacked engine parts on the floor, all of them coated with a greasy, rust preventive, and wrapped in special brown paper. There was an emergency generator and more parts stashed in the stowage below. The scariest part was the bilge full of oil just below the engines. All it took was a spark in the wrong place. Within minutes, the place could explode into an inferno. Harold felt his stomach knot up. Harold and all his mates went through the same firefighter training. In boot camp and in sub school, they had to enter the test facility with multiple fires, all burning at the same time. In that test, Harold remembered how he had to extinguish every fire before he could get out. It was pass or fail, one of the hardest exams in his life. It took everything Harold had to stay in that building and do his job. This was not a test. Under the dim emergency lighting, Harold took stock. Grayback was in enemy territory with a fire and an electrical panel in the engine room. He could visualize a wire with broken insulation, a wire that got hot and shorted out. A shower of sparks landed on a greasy rag. He could almost see the flames leap from the greasy rag to an oil spill on the floor. He could almost feel the heat on his arms or on the back of his hands. Harold muttered to himself, "Okay, any minute now, they'll sound all clear. Any minute now, power's going to come back on. Any minute now, the engines are going to start up. Any minute now, radar is going to come on. Any time now, come on, guys." When the power went off, the sonar had been all clear. That could change in mere seconds. They were stalled, helpless, like a turtle on its back. Harold could do nothing but wait and watch. He had to stay out of the way. His knee jiggled, he chewed his lip, he closed his bloodshot eyes. Red and yellow flames danced behind his eyelids. Inside his head, Harold was a kid again, a month shy of his 12th birthday. It was May, and he was standing on the lawn while his family's house burned. The smoke burned his nose and made his eyes water. He could feel the heat on his face. In his mind, the flames crackled. In his memory, there was a whooshing sound, and the roof fell in. Harold could still hear his mother's shouts. See both her arms wrapped around his 4-year-old brother Clyde. On the day of the house fire, all Harold had to do was get out of the house. The only thing he could do was stand and watch from a safe distance. The fire in the Grayback was a whole different level of horror. Harold muttered, "Come on, let's take it alone." Skipper asked, "How long has it been?" Harold replied, 3 minutes, sir." He had to let somebody else do it. Harold knew he could put that fire out. He trusted his own ability to use a CO2 fire extinguisher. He knew he could do it in less than 3 minutes, just like in the test building in sub school. Harold had to remind himself his duty was at Sonar until somebody told him otherwise. When the power came back on, he had to run through all the functions of the sonar and make sure there was no damage. He had to be there when the power came back on. His foot jiggled, his knee bounced. Harold chewed his lip and waited. He kept checking the sonar switches, dark and shadowy. No red or green lights glowed in the dark. Harold was usually the guy in the hot seat, one of the busiest guys in the control room. This was different. This was painful to endure. He couldn't see into the engine room. He couldn't hear the conversation on the voice-activated phone. He ran his fingers through his unwashed hair, well overdue for a barber. With one palm, he rubbed his whiskered cheek. He wondered, when was the last time I shaved? Whiskers and an OBA? That's going to be ugly. He would hold off putting on the oxygen device as long as he could. The oxygen breathing apparatus wouldn't get a good seal on his face with whiskers. Besides, the thing stunk like rubber. A fire inside a submarine could go wrong in a bazillion ways. Most of them had nothing to do with planes. Harold hovered and waited, poised to scan the sonar for enemy ships. Skipper said, "Littlejohn, man the deck guns. If we get a surprise visitor, I want to be ready." Officer of the deck, Ensign Robert Littlejohn, shouted into the sound-powered phone, "Battle stations, man the deck guns." Harold knew they were less than 75 miles from one of the Japanese islands. With current and wind drift, it would take only a day or two with no power to run aground. He grimaced at the thought. "Lord, I hope those guys get the power back on before daylight," he muttered. As soon as the sun came up, Japanese patrol planes would be back in the air. I'm going to close with that. And Tom, if you don't mind, would you read our submariners' toast to the men that are still on nocturnal patrol? We have our water here. And to be honest, on Tuesday evenings, we usually toast with bourbon.
Yeah.
Or what is, I'm sorry, it's maybe grog.
Yeah, rum.
Maybe rum.
There is a port of no return, where ships may ride at anchor for a little space, and then some starless night the cable slips, leaving an eddy at the mooring place. Gulls are no longer. Sailor, rest your oar. No tangled wreckage will be washed ashore. We raise our glasses in remembrance of those still on the eternal patrol.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. So we've talked about the research, we've talked about Tom's input and how we've gotten to this point. I'd like to open the floor up for questions. And Sandy, I'm going to ask you to moderate just a little bit because I may not be able to hear very well in this echoey room.
Sure, and you can either raise your hand or do the cartoon raising your hand, and I'll call on you, and you can ask a question of any one of the three people on the panel. Any questions? I have one.
Okay.
I have a question about kind of you know, when we were in the writing group together, you talked about you writing something and then you giving it to Tom and then him having you do major revisions. And I'm just wondering about how many revisions you went through and what was that like to constantly get it to be accurate according to, you know, Tom's background.
The good news is Tom is always available. So since we started working last summer, every week I send him pages and he edits as I go along. And he's editing for facts. And most of the time he'll say, it looks pretty good except for this one little detail. The facts aren't quite right and this happened and I have to rewrite usually only a small story. Maybe it's only one word. I used a phrase incorrectly or I used a term incorrectly. More recently, I was writing about the final day of the Grayback and what happened and the wreckage. And I had written the entire scene of the wreck and the final day, and he and I are studying the photographs currently available at the bottom of the sea on the Lots 52 project. And as we were talking, he suddenly realized that I had written the entire scene wrong because the wreckage was in one piece instead of broken up, that the doors had not been closed, that the boat had not had time to be pressurized and submerged. So I had to rewrite that entire section. But the good news is he edits as I go. So it's been extremely helpful and positive energy and generative. It inspires me to write more.
Good, thank you. I just wanted to thank you all, by the way. It just was a great, great mix. I loved, Gary's introduction. I love Tom's expertise. And, and you put it together just in a beautiful way, Wendy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. This has been great. I see my buddy Val there. Val Greco is on this call. Val Greco did the cover art for a book earlier this year. And Gary is extremely thrilled with it. Good job, Val.
Okay, Elaine, you have a question? You want to unmute? You're muted, Elaine.
Hi, how did Tom get involved in the historical aspect and archives? What prompted him to pursue this?
What prompted you to pursue getting involved in submarines and historical aspects?
Well, I served on nuclear submarines during the Cold War. And I hadn't thought about submarines in 30 years. I had a job that brought me through here. And I saw a sign advertising the drum. And I've only gone to sea on a diesel boat one time in sub school. So I stopped and I went through the drum. But I went on board. The smell brought back all the memories. I was choked out, tears in my eyes. I had to sit down on the deck in the torpedo room. Leslie Waters, the lady that was working here restoring the submarine, saw me. You okay? I waved at her and said, you must be a submarine veteran. And then later I caught up with her and she gave me a tour through the boat. And what really fascinated me when I got into the engine room, everything in the engine room was identical to what we had on the nuclear subs for emergency power and for oil purification. And then I learned, found out about the crew reunions. I came to his first reunion, and listened to their story. I got hooked on it. And then I dug up the patrol reports and read the patrol reports. I realized how historic the drum was. It's the oldest U.S. Navy submarine left in the world. It was the first of this class of submarines to be completed before the war. So it serves through the whole. It survived all. Just totally amazed me. The patrols they went through were something else. They were depth charges every time they went out. But they made it. And talking to the crew members after I got to go on board, I just had to learn more about the history. And I kept getting more and more involved in digging up the history of what all the submarines did in World War II. And it just totally fascinated me. The submarines had to carry the war for 2 years while we rebuilt. And we were sinking Japanese ships months before the rest of the Navy could even get to sea. And so what they did was just amazing. That a lot of that was with the older ones. But that's what got me going. I'm still digging history up.
Well, thank you. I'm in Wendy's writing group, and of course Harold has become so real to all of us in the group. And it's not just a young man that's gone off to war, but his personality, but it's a legacy of all the young people that served in every one of those wars. And it's a testament to all of you to keep that history alive and to educate people. I've been very educated by it. And I know in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, there's a very small submarine, which I took my grandchildren to. And I would recommend to anyone in New England. It gives you a sense of how constrained people were in those submarines. And it's a self-tour kind of thing, but it's, if people are looking for something, if they're heading up to Maine or New Hampshire from our area in Amherst, it might be worth just mentioning in some point, whether it's in the newsletter or something like that, Sandy. So yeah, and also Fall River has a battleship, and that's always an interesting thing. Well, you know, my excuse has been to take little grandsons, but you know what? It's good to go to those things even if you don't have children to go with. So thank you, thank all three of you for the education about this and keeping them alive in so many ways.
Thank you, Lenny.
Thank you.
Okay, Christy?
There. I just wanted to tell you guys you've done such a great job of integrating the personal family stories, like the part that you just read about their fire when the house burned down, Wendy, and into the historical record of the war and of their experience in the war. And so for me, it just feels like you have such a great foundation of the book of, you know, what real people did, how it affected real people's lives. And I wanted to tell you that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much, the three of you. It's been really a pleasure, and I've heard this several times, and like Christy, I'm just really thrilled to hear about it. It's just such quality writing, and it makes everything just come alive. And I get creeped out, you know, every time I feel like I'm in that submarine, you know, and what it's like.
Really?
Yeah. And
Tom
people,
explained it to me one time. It's like living in a three-bedroom ranch and inviting 80 relatives to stay with you, live with you for 6 weeks during the holidays.
yeah,
With
It really
salty
is
water,
1,800 square feet of livable space.
with salty water and bad coffee.
Yes,
okay,
and
well, thank you.
cigarettes because they smoked.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We like
Thank
the
you.
applause. It was a real
Thank you all.
pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.